You're listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House.
Hello everybody, this is Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House, and you're in for a treat. Since many of us are completely locked down, we thought to bring you a talk to stimulate our senses and evoke the sweet aroma of gardens. Gardens have a special place in the history of mankind. The Garden of Eden was the utopian land of the perfect man and woman. From the gardens of Versailles to the vast parks of the Taj Mahal, we have always attempted to recover this lost human condition. Indeed, these spaces were intended for rest and contemplation, and this can be seen in the word paradise, which was taken from the ancient Persian word to design an enclosed garden, paradisa. And today I have here with me Saif al-Rashidi, Director of the Barakat Trust, and Lara Zureikat. Lara is one of the leading designers in the field of landscape architecture and is the Associate Director for the Center for the Study of Built Environment in Amman, Jordan. She designed the first model water conserving park for the Jordan National Gallery of Fine Arts and worked on the gardens of the famous Palestinian Museum. Today, in this special episode, parts of Converging Paths, our initiative is sponsored by the Barakat Trust, the Al-Tajir Trust, and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. Lara and Saif will tell us more about the experience of enhancing the landscape of Palestine.
Thank you, Juan, and Lara, welcome, and it's lovely to have this conversation with you.
You were supposed to be in London in a few weeks, but due to the current circumstances, we decided to postpone it and to start off with an online conversation, which should mean that you have even more people coming to your talk when you finally come to the UK. But we thought it would be really interesting to talk about gardens, landscape, identity, and memory, something that you've worked on extensively, and it isn't a very common thing, and so we're particularly interested in talking to you about it. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which are probably the most famous gardens in the world, were built by a king for his homesick wife to evoke her homeland, which was probably in Iran or the north of Syria. And I think that's a remarkable thing thousands of years ago to think, well, how can I make someone happy? I'll create the landscape of their homeland. Similarly, in Spain, an Umayyad prince, Abdurrahman I, the Emir of Cordoba, wrote a beautiful poem talking about a lone palm tree in the west that had been uprooted. And he compares himself to a palm tree that's been taken from home. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is, why do you think it is that gardens and landscapes have this amazing ability to enable us to evoke a place that is somewhere else, to evoke a memory?
Thanks for having me, Saif. It's a very interesting question to think about. I hadn't thought of it before, actually, but perhaps because plants are the true natives of any land. They don't travel as easily as humans, and they were there before humans settled in various locations around the globe. In order for plants to survive or to inhabit a place, they need the right climate, the right soil, and all the right environmental factors to help them exist somewhere. So I think that's why they're so connected to a specific place and a specific location. Another thing I think about is perhaps because they're physically also rooted in a location, and that carries a kind of metaphorical association to being connected to land. That could be another reason. In the case of Abdurrahman that you mentioned, maybe seeing a palm tree, which is native to the Middle East and was widely cultivated there since antiquity, kind of connected him to his visual memory of his childhood home. So he remembered seeing palm trees. They were ingrained in his memory. And perhaps he even remembered eating dates as a child, or attempting to climb a trunk of a date palm, or relaxing under the shade of a palm grove. So all of these memories could have been evoked from seeing this palm tree and then associated with the place where he grew up. Today, even though we live in the world we live in today, the gardens are composed of both indigenous and introduced plants, but certain scents and certain plants do connect us to specific locations.
Well, I think that's a really interesting answer, and it's true what you say. I never really thought about the fact that plants are more rooted than anything else to a certain place. One of the projects that you've worked on, which has attracted a lot of attention and interest, is the Palestinian Museum, which you did the landscape design for, and which won an Aga Khan Khan Award for Architecture last year. The Aga Khan Award is generally given to projects that have great meaning and resonance and serve communities and are sustainable. I mean, it's a very deep and thoughtful award. And I wanted you to tell us a bit more about the social and community and environmental significance of the landscape that you did for the Palestinian Museum, because it wouldn't have won an Aga Khan Award had it not been outstanding.
Let me start by just telling you a little bit about the museum, maybe for the listeners that don't know much about it. The Palestinian Museum is the flagship project of the Ta'awan Welfare Association, which is a non-governmental development organization set up by Palestinian philanthropists. The museum was designed by Hennig and Peng architects based in Dublin. And as you mentioned, I was the collaborator on the landscape design. The project was a 20-year idea in the making, and it finally came to fruition in 2016 after much blood, sweat, and tears, as they say. And the focus of the museum is to promote Palestinian culture through exhibitions, research, and educational programs. You also mentioned the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, and that it recognizes projects, in my view, really, that combine both design excellence with community significance. And there's a lot of focus in the award about projects and buildings' contributions to improve the quality of life. I think the award jury citation sums up the significance of the project quite well. They describe the project as an act of hope for current and future generations. And that really actually struck me, because I think the museum was really successful in embodying Palestinian culture and identity by both adopting traditional architectural language of the terraced landscape, but also using modern forms and interpretations. It incorporates local materials and innovative detailing techniques, and its form is familiar and yet at the same time distinctive, and it has become an iconic building. It's also a project that instills a sense of pride in people, really, for its mere existence, and of course its mission.
Well, where did the idea of doing an evocative landscape come from? Was it always part of the plan, or was it something that evolved organically as the project progressed?
It's interesting because the project was actually an architectural competition, and I was contacted by the architects to be a collaborator on the project. And from the outset, initial design was about representing this terraced landscape. So the building really was part of the way the land was ordered, and that was a very early idea in the conception of the building.
And how did you go about developing the landscape so that it actually had significance?
I did a lot of research on the project, and I had also been exploring a lot of these ideas in earlier work that I had done before. So different projects I explored in smaller projects over time on a smaller scale, the notions of the cultural and the natural landscape, which became the primary drivers for the design of the museum gardens. So for me, the project was very much a merging of both personal and professional journeys that I was in my thinking and in my practice.
I mean, how did you actually go about doing the research to think about what plants you were going to plant and what their significance was as well?
A lot of it had to do with kind of my experiences as a child, what I recalled from my childhood, what was significant culturally for me. I also did interviews with elder members of my family and friends to try and understand what it is that they used to grow traditionally. I did a lot of field work in traveling to villages all over Palestine, recording, observing, and really absorbing the cultural lands around me. You know, the terraces in the museum are planted with rain-fed crops like wheat and chickpea, and the idea for me was that you could make a hummus sandwich or a zaytu za'atar sandwich, which is olive oil and oregano from the garden. And that was also an inspiration, that the ingredients you have in your pantry are there in the garden in front of you in their live form. Kind of the very common things that you take for granted or you eat regularly, but there they are actually celebrated in the context of the museum garden.
Were people surprised by the extent of the work that you did? And what kind of reactions did you get to the process of doing research, of visiting landscapes and taking photos? That can't be a very common thing.
People were pleasantly surprised by the landscape, at least the visitors that I've talked to who have come back to me and shared their experience. And to sum up, what they said to me was that they found it familiar yet distinctive. All the plants were somehow familiar, but the approach and the combination of the planting. So the collection of plants in the museum garden is one that you see every day. They'll be all around you if you live anywhere in the Palestine or in the Levant region, but many may not stop and appreciate their beauty. You may have picked sage or oregano or za'atar, for example, or mint from your grandmother's herb garden, or maybe even enjoyed them in your tea, but you never actually appreciated their physical beauty. So all of these culturally significant plants were planted en masse, for example, along the aromatic walk, the sea garden that's part of the museum that takes you from the upper terraces to the lower terraces. So I felt that it was important for the gardens to have meaning and to be experienced both on a sensory and an intellectual level, and using the sensory as a vehicle for this intellectual inquiry. So if you smell the scent of mint while you're going down through the gardens, it would remind you of something, and it would remind you of a part of your own culture in terms of like the food you consume, the kind of medicinal remedies that your grandmother would suggest that you do if you have a stomachache, and these kinds of ideas.
And actually the process of exploring the landscapes that inspired you beyond what you knew, what kind of reactions did you get to that process? Did people think it was odd that you were trying to find the meanings of landscape and plants, or did they see it as a legitimate thing?
I think people really got it. I think they really got that this is our landscape. This is about us. This represents us. Olives, pomegranates, figs, almonds, all of these associations with foods are something that everybody knows and can relate to culturally. It's very common, it's very practiced, it's something that unifies us and brings us together really over, food, over, having a meal together. I think people collectively agree that this is part of Palestinian culture.
And do you think that some of the plants have greater significance or additional significance beyond food and cuisine?
I think in this garden, there were a lot of ideas that were explored. And one of the theme gardens that comes to mind for me is a theme garden called the Garden of Perseverance. And it's particularly significant because it symbolizes Palestinian culture and identity under duress. So the idea of the garden came to me during my first and only visit to Palestine, where I did a lot of this field research that I mentioned to you. And I spent all my time, as I mentioned before, also visiting Palestinian villages and the countryside. And I was driven around by a taxi driver who was very patient with me because I would stop, every 5 minutes and photograph the hillsides. I'd keep photographing olives. I'd ask him to stop and I would be taking pictures. And I was wondering while I was doing that, what he thought of my actions, and really wondered what he thought of olive trees since they were everywhere. And I asked him, what do you think of olive trees? He said to him, the olive trees symbolizes the perseverance of the Palestinian people. Sumud al-Sha'b al-Falastini in Arabic. And that really stuck with me and became the kind of driving inspiration for this garden. So if I were to describe it, the centerpiece of the garden is an old olive tree, and the companion planting are salt bush and thorny burnet. And all of these plants in the garden, including the olive, have developed unique adaptations to cope with difficult environmental conditions. The olive tree withstands drought and survives on very little rainfall. It can also be uprooted very easily and transplanted. It's one of the easiest, trees to transplant. The salt bush grows in very saline soils and that would normally actually kill many plants, And the thorny burnet has a spiny cover that protects it from grazing, and it also defoliates in summer when conditions are really dry and hot. So the symbolism of these plants withstanding these difficult conditions and evolving and having these adaptations, for me, was another layer, let's say, of significance that can be added to this type of themed garden.
Well, I think it's nice that it's a themed garden that comes from common understandings of the fact that plants and trees have significance, that it's not an imposed significance or something that people can't relate to. I think that's really valuable.
Yes.
What made you decide to incorporate medicinal plants in the design?
I think medicinal plants, folk medicine, is a really important part of Palestinian culture and Levantine culture in general. So any city you go to, whether it's Damascus or Jerusalem or downtown Amman or any of these cities, you'll always find an herbalist shop or a attar. Maybe the literal translation would be like aromatary or something like that, if I were to make up a word, because and so these shops are everywhere and they specialize in aromatic herbs and medicinal plants. And while working on the project, I was fortunate enough to be able to visit the downtown core of Nablus, and I passed by a attar shop. And I ended up buying all these samples and writing notes and asking him what these remedies were for, and using all of these dry herbs that actually come from local plants, local, both culturally relevant and native plants that have medicinal qualities that have been used, for centuries in this part of the world. So I used a lot of these samples that I collected before I even ended up doing the ethnographic research that was needed to be able to include medicinal plants in a medicinal themed garden in the museum.
Do you think that for people who use the garden, do you think that gardens have significance as places more than an individual plant here or there? I mean, how do gardens feature in the culture of the Levant and Palestine and Greater Syria?
Gardens are very important, I think, especially in all of their forms, whether it's the courtyard garden or the kind of modern garden that we have in a lot of the newer cities, which are mostly, around setbacks that are part of either a backyard or a front garden. They've always been quite important. And I think traditionally they were important because they were sources of food production. A lot of the traditional gardens revolved around planting fruit trees, some of the herbs we talked about, and produce to be used in the house. So they were, part of the culture of having a productive garden.
And what about the less productive aspects of gardens like fragrance and scent?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think in addition to these productive plants, the majority of plants that you see in older gardens were very much of the scented variety, like roses, these old roses that you find in many old gardens, Jasminum sambaciflora, which is Arabian jasmine or full, gardenias. Those were very common and still are actually quite commonly planted in gardens here. And a lot of these plants we also included in the Palestinian Garden Museum.
And do they appear in popular culture like literature or songs and poems?
They do, actually. There's a famous Damascene song that references al-ful wal-ward wal-yasmin, which is, roses, jasmine, and this Arabian jasmine.
Yeah, well, I think that's the wonderful thing about gardens, is that they combine productive functions with also their uplifting and relaxing and beautiful places. In the developing world especially, though, there's sometimes a view that leisure spaces are frivolous and that other necessities are more pressing. And I wonder what your reaction would be to that argument that, surely countries have more important things to spend their money on than lovely parks and gardens. What do you think?
I think this is a common view, unfortunately. And I think well-being in general is undervalued in our culture, really. I mean, I think we focus so much on food, shelter, economic security, and all of these are essential, obviously. But I think physical, mental health is really, connected to access to open green space, And I think it's a necessity and not a luxury, in my view. And the idea that everyone, and especially the underprivileged, is entitled to open green space is also democratic. So I feel it's important to focus on these and actually allow people to have access to public space.
And do you think at a time when a lot of the world is homebound and locked in, do you think it will have an impact on public space and how we view public space and ultimately how cities are designed?
I think so. I mean, there's a lot of conjecture on this topic in particular right now because we've all been experiencing the same thing and we've all been thinking about it as people involved in planning and urban design. I think people have now found a newfound or perhaps even renewed appreciation of public space. Even a small space such as a street, which is part of a network of open spaces, I think is appreciated a lot more now, especially in the absence of automobiles. I know in my own neighborhood now in Amman, since we've been under lockdown and we've been applying all these social distancing measures, I've seen more people walking in the neighborhood than I have ever before. Since driving was banned here as well, there are very, very few cars on the streets, and people have been walking to get their groceries, to exercise. And in the last 6 weeks, haven't even been driving cars at all. That's made a huge impact both on emissions and on our ability to enjoy walking outside. They say it takes 6 weeks for people to form a habit, so I'm hoping this sticks because it's been 6 weeks already. So I think really the absence of automobiles, we've never seen something like this on this scale everywhere, all over the world. To be able to photograph all these, I've seen like photographs all over the world being published of famous public spaces, with no cars in sight. This is really quite rare to see. And I think planners and urban designers and people were always aware of the problems of designing around cars. But I think the public wasn't as aware, and I think now they can see something on the ground, what it's like to live without one, and what the benefits that you gain, if not everything is centered around it. I hope that this is going to influence the way we plan our cities in the future.
Also, one of the challenges that one has to think about in the Middle East, and Jordan is a good example, is the scarcity of water. Do you think that the models you're developing and working with are applicable to other places?
I mean, indeed, Jordan is a country that has severe water challenges. It reminds me of the first project I worked on when I started working with CSBE, the research center that I work with. And the project was focused on water conservation and landscapes and how to design landscapes that don't consume a lot of water, which is very much part of the mission of the center, is to disseminate this knowledge publicly and address these challenges that we face. So we published a lot on the topic. Both homeowners and professionals reduce their water consumption when doing landscapes in general or gardening. So I think these models can apply to other places because I think everywhere in the world now with climate change, a lot of places will be facing water shortages. These are places that are usually not accustomed to having this type of problem. So they can learn from other places that have faced water challenges like Jordan, California, Arizona, a lot of the places with drier climates that have come up with different techniques and technologies to deal with these challenges.
And you're also an architect. So I was wondering, in terms of architectural design, do you think we should be designing differently? And is there anything we should learn from what we've been going through in this period of global lockdown?
I think what comes to mind to me is flexibility and flexibility in the use of space. I've been working from home a lot, like most people now, and on the dining room table. So I would love to see a dining room table that doubles as a dining room table and maybe an ergonomically sound workspace. I've been suffering a little bit from this type of setup. So I think convertible spaces, flexibility, The other thing that comes to mind is having some kind of access to green space, whether it's a small balcony or a sunroom or a small area where you can go outside if you can. I think that's kind of essential now.
You spoke a lot about memories and talking to older people and older relatives, but I wanted to ask you about young people and landscape. What sorts of things are you doing to engage them today? And are you witnessing a growing interest in landscapes among younger people, or is it something that is waning in importance?
The museum is very active in their outreach, and it's located on a university campus. So a lot of students visit the university. They have a lot of programs for schools to visit. So it is they take in a lot of visitors. I think there's, among younger people in particular, a resurgence of interest in the local landscape. What I've noticed is that there's like a local movement in the design fields in general, where local and traditional culture are a main inspiration. So people are really looking locally rather than looking abroad for inspiration, which what used to happen. I think in the past 10 years, there's been a shift in people really looking at local culture, local flora, and using that as a kind of source of inspiration for design and creation in general. There's a lot of, bloggers and people on Instagram, and you see a lot of people actually going out into nature, photographing, really appreciating the diversity of the native flora. And you didn't see that in the past. And maybe, social media has made these efforts more visible as well. But I do think it's a definite change and a jump from 10, 15 years ago.
And specifically with regards to your own work, what do you think moved you most about seeing people interact with the landscape that you designed in the Palestinian Museum?
I think when people react to something emotionally and, find it uplifting, for me, that's a great source of satisfaction.
Do you find that in your garden, is there one thing that stands out as being something that many people relate to and many people show appreciation for?
I think the way the landscape blends with the surrounding landscape. I think for them, it's almost a reflection of what's around you. And I think it's quite visible when you're there on site, seeing that connection between the larger landscape and the smaller one of the museum.
Okay, well, it's nice that they feel that belongs in its context, that it isn't an alien thing.
Exactly. Actually, this reminds me of something that happened during the design process. In one of the interim reviews, the project went through a peer review, and some of the comments that came back were, why isn't there lawn or ornamental trees in the garden? That precisely for that reason, because these do not blend and they're sort of not part of the context of this landscape. But that's sometimes what people expect to be in a museum garden. And I think the garden itself went against people's perceptions of what should be in the garden and what you expect. But then when you see what's there, you find it maybe more beautiful than what you had expected.
I think that's a lovely success, to have surprised people in a good way.
Yes, I was very happy about that, because I felt like I was really taking a chance, actually, doing this type of landscape. It's definitely what people don't expect, but then they're pleasantly surprised by it. Working with this perennial type of landscape is quite difficult, because in the spring, everything is green. In the summer and fall, things start to yellow and then turn brown. And people really value green over yellow and brown. But there is a way to highlight beauty and show that, yellow and brown can be beautiful, because it is part of the way our landscape behaves. And then you can do it in a way that is beautiful as well. Like you can design it in a way where you can appreciate that kind of perennial beauty.
You're in an enviable position to have won a very important award quite young in your career, I would say. How does that make you think of your future, and what kind of projects do you want to work on building upon your current success?
Well, I mean, it's very humbling to have received this award. And at the same time, it's also a responsibility, to kind of live up to it as well, and keep doing good work, keep pushing yourself to push yourself to retain a kind of level of excellence in the work that you produce. The Palestinian Museum itself was almost also a labor of love and a great opportunity for me to be able to use all the knowledge that I have developed over the years and actually put it all into this project. But then I learned also a lot from it, and I hope that I can apply also what I've learned in future work.
And you're telling me that you're doing some projects that specifically involve schools and getting them involved in landscape and thinking about their landscapes?
Yes, the urban agriculture project I mentioned to you before, we're working with public schools and doing an activity manual for public school kids or school-age children to grow their own food in schools. So it's very much about getting school children to learn about plants, learn about growing food, learn about seasonality, and hopefully have them be more connected to nature, actually instill a sense of stewardship towards it.
Which is really important, that you're actually using your expertise to engage young people, and presumably having good examples of what a difference it can make is a very inspiring thing.
We hope so.
I think we're at a time more than any other when people need uplifting and need positive spirits and need something to make them feel good. And gardens, when you look at poetry of gardens around the world and people that describe them in literature and memories, they tend to record them and describe them as beautiful, uplifting places. Have you experience of people reacting to your own gardens in terms of being uplifting to the spirit?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because intellectually I had always, thought of gardens that way. I mean, you study about the healing qualities of gardens, a lot has been published about the use of gardens and nature in hospital settings and how it really helps with the healing process of patients. But personally, I did come across something that actually had a profound effect on the way I think, and it really touched me, actually, this incident. I had designed a garden for a relative of mine, and he used to spend a lot of time sitting in the garden, and it was a very small garden, but turned out to be quite beautiful, quite colorful. And there were a lot of plants, that bloomed over different seasons. And he noticed that this one lady, probably lived close by, would always be walking around the neighborhood, and she would stop and she would look in through the gate and sit and look at the garden for a while. And after she did that a few times, he ended up striking a conversation and asking her, why she would stop and look at the garden. And she told him that whenever she was down, she would stop by and she would look at the garden, and it would make her feel better, and that it brought her a sense of joy. And he shared that with me, and he actually called me and said, "You've touched people's hearts, and that is a great achievement." It was really heartwarming to hear that, because it's one thing to get compliments from your peers and the professional circle about your work, but to think that you actually helped someone, overcome a bad day or gave them, a sense of joy through your creation is something very satisfying.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that public parks play that function really importantly and really significantly. And one of the great things about the Palestinian Museum landscape is that it is public, and I'm sure it uplifts people's spirits every day.
I hope that that's the case, because that is the most satisfying, I think, reward of doing this kind of work.
Well, thank you, Lara. It was really interesting to talk to you. And I just wanted to ask you one last thing. We started
Sure.
off by talking about an Umayyad prince who fled from Syria to Spain and felt moved by a palm tree that reminded him of his homeland. If you were to choose a plant or a tree that would remind you of Jordan and of your own upbringing and your background, what would it be?
Well, the national tree of Jordan is a deciduous oak, and I actually love that tree. It's quite sculptural, majestic. I think I would choose that. I would choose the national tree of Jordan, deciduous oak. I think because it's unique to this area, this particular tree. An olive tree, of course, would be the second one. The second tree I would choose is an olive.
So if you were to do a Jordanian landscape, it would include both?
Yes, why not, actually? Oaks and olives. But I mean, it is the two sides of it.
Well, thank you very much. It was really fascinating to listen to you, to think about how you did research, thought about history and meaning and identity, and produced an award-winning landscape based on all of that. And I'm sure many people will be inspired by what you have done.
Thank you so much for having me, Saif. I really enjoyed talking to you as well.
You were listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House. For more information, please visit our website, asiahousearts.org.